Welcome to Greyvale Echoes. Dive into chilling gothic horror, where haunted castles, ghostly secrets, and eerie relics unravel terrifying truths. Join us for spine-tingling tales of the unknown. Welcome back. Some haunted settings hold their secrets deep within the water. Tonight, we drift to a lonely lake at midnight, where a local fisherman discovers that the tragic cries of Mary Feltram did not end with her death. Our story tonight does not take place within the cold, stone walls of a castle or the dusty, forgotten rooms of a haunted mansion. It takes place under the vast, open sky, in a setting whose beauty is both profound and deeply deceptive. We journey to a remote lake in the northern country, a great, dark body of water known to the locals simply as the Blackmere. It is a place of immense, quiet beauty, but also one steeped in a history of sorrow and whispered legend. And on a particular night, under the cold, watchful eye of a full moon, the Blackmere was about to give up one of its oldest and most tragic secrets. Our witness to this event was not a nervous scholar or a romantic youth prone to flights of fancy. He was a man of the lake, a man as weathered and as steady as the ancient stones that lined its shore. His name was Silas, and he was a fisherman. He had lived his entire life, all 60-some years of it, in a small cottage within sight of the Blackmere. The lake was not just his livelihood. It was his world. He knew its moods, its currents, its hidden depths. He knew where the treacherous rocks lay just beneath the surface, and where the great, ancient pikes slumbered in the deep, cold water. He had spent more nights out on this lake, alone in his small, sturdy boat, than most people had spent in their own beds. He was a man of quiet contemplation, not easily spooked, a man who had seen all the tricks of light and sound that the natural world could play and had long since learned to dismiss them. He believed in what he could see, what he could touch, and what he could catch in his nets. On this particular night, Silas had rowed out to the center of the lake, to a spot he favored for the sweet, silver-sided fish that could only be caught in the deep, still hours after midnight. The night was preternaturally calm. There was no wind. Not even the faintest whisper of a breeze stirred the air. And as a result, the lake had transformed. It was no longer a body of water. It had become a perfect, unbroken sheet of black glass. The surface of the Blackmere was so unnaturally still, so flawlessly smooth, that it had become a perfect mirror of the heavens above. The sky was clear, a vast, dark vault of indigo pricked with the sharp, diamond dust of a million stars. And the lake reflected them perfectly. Every star, every constellation, every faint, milky smudge of a distant nebula was duplicated in the inky blackness below. As Silas sat in his small boat, it felt as if he were no longer floating on water, but was suspended in the vast, silent emptiness of deep space. He could see the stars above him and the stars beneath him. There was no horizon, no dividing line between the real and the reflection. It was a profoundly beautiful, but also a deeply disorienting sensation. He felt untethered, a solitary human soul adrift in an ocean of galaxies. The silence was as perfect as the stillness. The usual night sounds, the call of an owl, the rustle of some small creature in the reeds along the shore were all absent. It was as if the entire world were holding its breath, caught in a moment of sublime and slightly unnerving peace. The only thing that broke this perfect, cosmic illusion was the moon. It was a full moon, a great, silver-white disk hanging high in the sky, and its light was brilliant. But it was not a warm or friendly light. It was a cold, clinical, almost surgical light. It bleached the color from the world, rendering everything in stark shades of silver, white, and black. It painted a long, shimmering silver path across the surface of the black water, a road of liquid light that seemed to lead from the heavens directly to his small boat. The familiar, tree-lined shores of the lake, which he knew so well, were transformed by this ghostly light. The trees became strange, skeletal figures, their branches like twisted, bony arms reaching for the sky. The familiar rocks along the shore looked like the bleached skulls of forgotten giants. The moonlight did not illuminate the landscape. It haunted it, turning the comfortable and the familiar into something alien and strange. And in the distance, rising from the center of this moon-drenched, star-dusted lake, was the one feature that always carried a hint of menace, no matter the time of day. It was a small, teardrop-shaped island, known to all the locals as Snake's Island. It was not a large place, perhaps only an acre or two, but it was a dark, tangled, and unwelcoming patch of land. It was covered in a dense, primeval growth of gnarled, ancient yew trees, their dark foliage so thick that it seemed to swallow the light. Even now, under the brilliant glare of the full moon, the island remained a lump of impenetrable blackness, a place that refused to be illuminated. Its shores were not gentle beaches, but sharp, black rocks that jutted from the water like broken teeth. The island had a sinister reputation, And its name was not just a flight of fancy. It was infested with adders, the only venomous snake in the region. They slithered among the twisted roots of the yew trees, a silent, venomous population that made the island a place of real, physical danger. But the locals' fear of the place went beyond a simple fear of snakes. The island was considered haunted. It was a place of bad luck, of dark history. Stories were told in hushed tones around winter fires, stories of strange lights seen dancing among the trees, of eerie, whispering sounds carried on the wind from its shores. It was a place where people had gone missing, where boats had been found empty, drifting near its rocky coast. It was a place the locals avoided. No one fished near its shores. No one landed on its banks, especially not after dark, especially not on a night with a full moon. Silas, a man of practical mind, had always scoffed at these stories. He believed the island's reputation was simply a product of its natural dangers and its gloomy appearance. But even he, a man who feared very little, felt the unsettling presence of the island tonight. It sat in the distance, a black, silent heart in the center of the silver lake, and he could feel its presence as a kind of low, humming dread at the back of his mind. It was a focal point for the night's strangeness, a dark, brooding entity that seemed to be watching him. He kept his boat a respectful distance away, his practical fishing sense reinforced by a prickle of ancient, superstitious caution that he would never have admitted to anyone. He was content to stay in his own patch of open water, to pull his silver fish from the depths, and to leave the island and its secrets alone. He was a solitary fisherman, at peace in his element, but he was also a lone man in a vast, haunted setting, and the first faint stirrings of a primal unease were beginning to disrupt his calm. The night was too still, the moon was too bright, and the shadow of Snake's Island was too dark. Something, he felt, was about to break the perfect, terrible stillness. Silas sat in his small boat, a solitary figure in a universe of silver light and black water. The profound stillness of the night, which had at first been a thing of sublime beauty, had begun to feel unnatural. It was a silence that was too perfect, a calm that felt like a held breath. The world was waiting. He pulled one of his lines from the deep, the silver body of a small, struggling fish flashing in the moonlight as he brought it aboard. The familiar, mundane act of his trade was a small comfort, an anchor to the real and the normal in a night that was feeling increasingly unreal. He worked with the quiet efficiency of a man who has performed the same task 10,000 times, his calloused hands moving with a grace and certainty that belied his age. It was as he was rebaiting his hook that the first change occurred, a shift in the air. It began with the temperature, a sudden, inexplicable drop in the air temperature so sharp and so immediate that it felt as if a door to a vast, subterranean ice cave had been opened somewhere nearby. The mild, late summer air was instantly replaced by a biting, autumnal chill. Silas shivered, a deep, involuntary tremor that shook his entire frame. He could see his own breath clouding in front of him, a white plume of vapor in the cold moonlight. He frowned, pulling the collar of his thick, woolen coat tighter around his neck. The feeling was deeply unsettling. The night had been calm and temperate. There were no clouds to block the residual warmth of the day, no source for this sudden, piercing cold. It was a pocket of winter that had manifested in the heart of a summer night. And with the cold came the wind. The glassy, mirrored surface of the lake, which had been so perfectly still, was suddenly shattered. An impossible wind began to howl across the water, seemingly born from the very center of the lake itself. It was not a gentle breeze that built in strength. It was a sudden, violent gust, a physical force that made his small boat rock and sway. It whipped the surface of the Black Mirror into a frenzy of small, dark, choppy waves, destroying the perfect reflection of the stars and turning the water into a chaotic, churning mess. The wind was as cold as the air, a raw, icy blast that seemed to carry the chill of the deep, sunless parts of the lake within it. It howled around his boat with a low, mournful, and distinctly personal sound. It did not sound like a natural force. It sounded like a moan. It sounded like a creature in pain. Silas gripped the sides of his boat, his knuckles white, his practical fisherman's mind struggling to find a rational explanation. A sudden weather front? A microburst? He had lived on this lake his entire life, and he had never experienced anything like it. A wind that came from nowhere, that was as cold as the grave, and that rose and fell with the rhythmic, sorrowful cadence of a lament. The hairs on the back of his neck and on his weathered arms stood on end. The ancient, superstitious part of his mind, the part that listened to the old stories told by the fire, was beginning to stir, to whisper that this was no ordinary wind. And it was then, carried on the back of that cold, moaning wind, that he heard the voice. At first, it was so faint, so intertwined with the sound of the wind itself, that he could not be sure he had heard it at all. It was a high, thin thread of a sound, a note of sorrow that was almost lost in the greater sorrow of the wind's howl. He froze, his head cocked, his entire being focused on listening. He told himself it was just a trick of the acoustics, the wind whistling over the edge of his boat in a peculiar way. He was a man alone in a vast, empty space. The mind, he knew, could play tricks in such situations. But then the sound came again, and this time it was clearer, it was closer, and it was, without a shadow of a doubt, the sound of a woman weeping. It was not a loud sound. It was a soft, choked, and utterly heartbroken sobbing. The sound of a grief so profound that it seemed to be a physical thing, a weight of pure misery being carried on the air. The sound seemed to come from all around him at once. It was in the wind that whipped past his ears. It was in the rhythmic slapping of the choppy water against the hull of his boat. It was in the very air he was breathing. The sound was everywhere, yet it had no discernible source. A cold, hard knot of fear, a fear unlike any he had felt since he was a small child afraid of the dark, began to form in the pit of his stomach. The old stories, the local legends he had always dismissed with a gruff, practical wave of his hand. They all came flooding back to him now, their chilling details suddenly feeling not like fanciful tales, but like grim, historical warnings. He knew, with a certainty that defied all reason, whose voice he was hearing. This was the ghostly cry of Mary Feltram. The legend of Mary Feltram was the Blackmere's most famous and most tragic tale. She had been a young woman, beautiful and full of life, who had lived in the village more than a generation ago. She had fallen in love with a man who was deemed unsuitable by her stern, wealthy father. They had planned to elope, to run away and start a new life together. But on the night they were meant to escape, something had gone terribly wrong. Mary had disappeared. Weeks later, her body had been found, washed up on the rocky, unwelcoming shore of Snake's Island. The official story, the one recorded in the parish records, was that she had been rowing across the lake to meet her lover. Her boat had capsized in a sudden squall, and she had drowned.
Un tragique accident.
But the locals had always whispered a different story. They said there had been no storm that night. They said her father, a cruel and unforgiving man, had discovered her plan and had confronted her. They whispered of a terrible argument, of violence. They whispered that her death was no accident. And they whispered that her spirit, her sorrowful, wronged wraith, had never left the lake. It was said that on certain nights, on nights with a full moon when the water was still, you could hear her. You could hear her weeping for her lost love, her lost life, her stolen future. Silas had always thought it was just a story, a way for old women to frighten children. But the sound he was hearing now, it was not the sound of a story. It was the sound of a real and present grief. The weeping grew in volume, rising from a soft, choked sob into a full-throated, unrestrained cry of pure, soul-shattering despair. It was a wail of such immense sorrow that it seemed to make the very stars in the sky tremble. It was the sound of a heart breaking over and over again for all eternity. He frantically scanned the entire circumference of the lake. The cold, bright moonlight illuminated the shorelines for miles in every direction. There were no other boats on the water. The shore was deserted. There was no house, no cottage, no lover's lane from which a sound like this could be coming. He was utterly, completely alone. And yet, the sound of the weeping woman was all around him, a tangible, audible presence in the empty, moonlit world. The source of the cry was not physical. It was not of his world. It was a sound that was breaking through from somewhere else. A sound from a place of eternal sorrow. The chilling cry was coming from the past. It was the sound of a 20-year-old tragedy, replaying itself right here, right now, for an audience of one. The practical, sensible fisherman was gone, replaced by a terrified, superstitious old man, alone in a small boat in the middle of a haunted lake. The legend of Mary Feltram was no longer a legend. It was a terrifying, supernatural reality, and he was at the very center of it. The wind howled, the water churned, and the ghostly, heartbreaking cry of a long-dead woman filled the night, a chilling encounter that had only just begun. He had heard the voice of the ghost, and he had a terrible, sinking feeling that he was about to see her, too. The wail of the ghost, the cry of Mary Feltram, had shattered the night. For Silas, the world had been stripped of its familiar, comfortable reality and replaced by a stark, supernatural terror. He sat frozen in his small, rocking boat, his hands gripping the wooden gunwale so tightly that his knuckles were white, bloodless mountains in the pale moonlight. He was no longer a fisherman. He was a witness, a terrified, solitary audience to a tragedy that was replaying itself from beyond the grave. The cold wind whipped at him, carrying the sound of that eternal, heartbreaking sorrow, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to flee, to row for the shore with all his might, to put this haunted water behind him. But he could not. He was paralyzed by a fear so profound it had become a physical weight, rooting him to the spot. The bright moonlight, which had earlier been a source of strange, sterile beauty, now became an instrument of pure terror. Its brilliant, silvery light was a cruel and treacherous thing. It did not offer clarity or safety. Instead, it created a world of stark, terrifying contrasts. The surface of the choppy water was a dazzling, shifting field of silver, so bright it was painful to look at. But between the silver peaks of the small waves were troughs of absolute, impenetrable blackness. The moon's treachery was in the shadows it created. The dark water between the moonlit ripples looked as deep and as black as the void of space. And in those moving, shifting patches of darkness, anything could be hiding. His eyes darted back and forth, frantically scanning the water around his boat. Every dark patch seemed to hold a shape, a form that was not just a shadow. He saw things, or thought he saw things, just beneath the surface. A flicker of movement. The long, dark shape of something swimming just below his boat. The pale, white glimmer of what could have been a face, turning slowly in the depths. There for an instant and then gone. His mind, already reeling from the impossible sound, was now turning on him, populating the dark water with the creatures of his own fear. The lake was no longer just water. It was a living, breathing entity, and its dark, cold depths were now filled with a menacing and unseen life. It was then that he noticed a new disturbance on the water, a disturbance that was not caused by the wind. A short distance from his boat, perhaps only 20 or 30 feet away, a patch of the lake's surface began to behave strangely. While the rest of the water was being churned into a chaotic chop by the wind, this one specific spot was doing something different. The water was bubbling. It was not a violent bubbling, but a gentle, steady, and deeply unnatural churning. Small, oily-looking bubbles were rising from the depths and breaking on the surface with a soft, plopping sound. It was as if something large were stirring on the lakebed below, releasing pockets of gas that had been trapped in the mud for a century. Or, a more terrifying thought, it was as if something were breathing down there, its slow, steady exhalations rising to the surface. Silas stared at the spot, his mouth dry, his heart hammering against his ribs. The wind could not create this. It was a localized, specific event, a sign of something rising from the deep. The bubbling patch of water began to slowly, almost imperceptibly, move, and it was moving towards his boat. It was a slow, deliberate approach, a predator stalking him through the dark water. The source of the haunting was no longer a disembodied sound all around him. It now had a location, a focus, and it was coming for him. As the patch of bubbling water drew closer, the lament, the ghostly cry, grew louder. The sound was no longer a diffuse, ambient wail that seemed to come from the wind itself. It was now directional. The weeping was coming directly from that spot. The source of the cry was in that patch of churning, bubbling water. The impossible sound now had an impossible source. The weeping was so close now, so sharp and so clear, that it was almost unbearable. It sounded as if the woman were right there, just beside his boat. Her head just under the surface of the black, churning water. Her cries muffled only slightly by the thin layer of liquid that separated her world from his. He could hear the small, hitching gasps for breath between the sobs. He could hear the raw, ragged pain in her throat. It was a sound of such pure, undiluted misery that it felt like a physical assault. And the cry was having a strange and terrifying effect on him. He was overcome with a deep, profound, and inexplicable sadness. It was not his own sadness. It was an emotion that was being forced upon him. A psychic wave of pure grief radiating from the approaching presence. He felt a lump form in his own throat. His eyes began to burn with unshed tears. The despair of the ghost was so powerful that it was infecting him, drowning his own terror in a sea of supernatural sorrow. It was a chilling encounter of the most intimate kind, a direct transmission of an emotion from beyond the grave. He was feeling what Mary Feltram had felt in her final, terrifying moments. The hopelessness, the betrayal, the overwhelming, all-consuming grief. He wanted to look away, to close his eyes, to block out the sight of the approaching disturbance and the sound of the terrible, infectious weeping. But he was mesmerized, held captive by the sheer, unfolding horror of it. The bubbling patch of water was now only a few feet from his boat. The weeping was a deafening roar of sorrow in his ears. The feeling of supernatural sadness was so strong, he felt his own heart might break from the sheer weight of it. He could smell it now, too. A new scent rising from the bubbling water, a scent that overpowered the clean, fresh smell of the lake. It was the foul, thick, and gaggingly sweet smell of the deep lakebed, of centuries of mud and decay. The smell of things that have rotted away in the dark, sunless, oxygen-deprived depths. It was the smell of the grave, a wet, pungent version of the dry, dusty scent of a tomb. It was the breath of the thing that was rising to meet him. The boat rocked violently as the churning water reached it. Silas gripped the sides, his knuckles cracking, his eyes wide with a terror that was now absolute. This was it, the final moment. He had heard the ghost. He had felt its sorrow. And now he was about to see it. The water directly beside his boat was a roiling, bubbling cauldron. The weeping was a direct, personal cry of anguish in his ear, and the stench of the grave filled his nostrils. He was completely surrounded, besieged by a full, multisensory, supernatural assault. The barrier between his world and the world of the dead had been completely and utterly destroyed. He was no longer on the lake. He was in the haunting. Silas was a man adrift in a sea of his own terror. The small, sturdy fishing boat, which had been his sanctuary and his livelihood for a lifetime, had now become a cage, a tiny, fragile raft in an ocean of supernatural horror. The water directly beside the boat was no longer water. It was a churning, chaotic vortex, a gateway to some other, colder world. The bubbling intensified, no longer gentle, but violent. The surface of the lake frothed and seethed, as if a great fire were burning in the depths, boiling the water from below. The air was thick and heavy with the foul, sulphurous stench of decay, a smell so potent it made his eyes water and his stomach heave. The ghostly weeping was no longer a sound he heard, but a vibration he felt in his very bones, a physical manifestation of a sorrow so immense it was shaking his entire world. He was trapped. There was no escape. His oars were useless against the strange, localized turbulence. All he could do was grip the sides of his rocking boat and stare, with wide, unblinking eyes, into the roiling heart of the disturbance. He was a man watching his own nightmare crawl into reality. And then, it began to rise. From the very center of the churning, bubbling cauldron of water, a shape began to emerge. It was not a sudden appearance. It was a slow, deliberate, and utterly silent ascent, aside from the constant, heartbreaking sound of the weeping. At first, it was just a darkening of the water, a solid, black mass taking form in the chaos. Then, it broke the surface. It was a shape that was vaguely, horribly human. It rose from the lake with a serene, dreamlike slowness, the dark water of the Black Mere streaming from it in black, oily rivulets. It was a figure, a spectral figure, the form of a woman, but she was not made of flesh and bone. She seemed to be sculpted from the very substance of the lake at night. Her form was indistinct, her edges blurred and smoky, as if she were made of shadow and dark water and captured moonlight. Her hair, long and black, floated around her head like a cloud of seaweed, and her simple, peasant-style dress clung to her ethereal form, looking as if it were woven from the lake's own mist. She was translucent. Silas could almost see the dark water of the lake through her ghostly body. She was a vision, a phantom, a memory of a person given a terrible, watery form. This was her. This was the ghost of Mary Feltram, the legend made real, the sorrow given shape. She rose higher and higher from the water, until she was standing on its surface, a tall, sorrowful specter, her feet not touching the water but hovering just above it, the lake churning at her base as if in terrified worship. The weeping sound now came directly from this impossible figure, a sound of eternal, undying grief. Silas stared, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. His entire lifetime of pragmatic, rational thought was being systematically dismantled by this single, impossible sight. Ghosts were stories. They were whispers for the fireside. They were not real. They did not rise from the depths of the lake to stand on the water under a full moon. And yet, here she was, a ghostly vision, a chilling encounter that was so real, so undeniable, that it was breaking his mind. As the spectral figure of Mary Feltram became clearer, as her form solidified from a smoky shadow into a more defined, if still translucent, shape, Silas saw the most horrifying detail of all. A detail that was not in any of the legends. A detail that changed the entire story from a simple, tragic ghost tale into something infinitely more complex and more heartbreaking. The phantom of Mary Feltram was not alone. She was cradling something in her arms. It was a small bundle held tightly to her chest in the classic protective posture of a mother. The shape was unmistakable, even in its ghostly, indistinct form. It was the shape of a baby, a small infant, wrapped in what looked like a spectral, tattered shawl. It was as silent and as ghostly as the woman who held it. Its form was even less distinct than hers, a mere suggestion of a child, a phantom of a phantom. This was the source of the mystery. This was the heart of the secret. The stories had always spoken of Mary Feltram, the drowned lover, but they had never spoken of a child. This single, terrible detail rewrote the entire legend. Her death was not the simple, tragic drowning of a heartbroken girl. It was something far worse. It was the death of a mother and her child. The weeping that filled the air now took on a new, and even more terrible meaning. It was not just the cry of a lost soul, grieving for her own stolen life. It was the eternal, supernatural lament of a mother for her lost child. It was the sound of a grief so powerful, so primal, that it had defied death itself. A sorrow so immense that it had stained the very fabric of this place, doomed to echo here for all time. The ghostly figure, with the phantom child held tight in her arms, began to turn. It moved with the same slow, dreamlike grace with which it had risen, its form gliding over the surface of the churning water. Turned its head, and its face came into view. It was a face of sublime and terrible beauty, a face that was both young and agelessly ancient. It was a face carved from moonlight and sorrow, and its eyes were two dark, hollow voids, empty sockets that held no light, only an endless, bottomless despair. And for one eternal, heart-stopping moment, those hollow, dark eyes seemed to look directly at Silas. He felt the gaze not as a sight, but as a touch, a cold, psychic touch that seemed to press directly against his soul. In that gaze, he felt the full, undiluted weight of her tragedy. He felt her fear, her betrayal, her final, agonizing moments. He felt her love for the child in her arms, a love that was as fierce and as eternal as her grief. He felt everything. He was no longer just a witness. He was a participant. He was sharing in her sorrow, her rage, her despair. Her face, a mask of unending, hopeless agony, was a sight that would be burned into his memory forever, a ghost that would haunt him long after this night was over. She held his gaze for a long moment, a silent, terrible communion between the living and the dead. It was as if she were showing him, deliberately, as if she were saying, see what was done to us. See the truth that was buried beneath the lies. Remember us. It was a plea, a demand, a final, ghostly testimony given to the first person in 20 years who had been unfortunate, or perhaps fated, enough to be here to receive it. And then, as slowly and as gracefully as she had risen, she began to sink. The spectral figure of the mother and her phantom child descended back into the dark, churning water. Her hollow eyes never left his, even as the water began to swirl around her waist, her shoulders, her neck. The last thing to disappear was her face, that beautiful, terrible mask of eternal despair. And then she was gone. The moment her form vanished beneath the surface, the water grew still. The violent bubbling ceased. The foul stench of decay dissipated. The cold, moaning wind died away. And the ghostly weeping, the sound that had filled the world with its sorrow, faded into a final, heartbroken sigh, and then into absolute silence. The lake was once again a perfect, black mirror, reflecting the cold, indifferent stars. The boat was still. The air was calm. It was as if nothing had happened. It was as if the entire, terrifying, supernatural event had been a dream, a hallucination. But Silas knew it was real. The image of the ghostly mother and her child was seared into his mind. The feeling of her profound, infectious sorrow still ached in his own heart. And the cold, the deep, unnatural, grave cold still clung to him, a chill that he felt would never truly leave him. He had seen the true, unsolved secret of Snake's Island. He had witnessed the vision from the deep, and the course of his simple, quiet life, like the still, dark water of the lake, had been shattered forever. The silence that descended upon the Black Mirror was more profound than any that had come before. It was not the peaceful silence of the beginning of the night, nor the charged, expectant silence that had preceded the haunting. This was the hollow, ringing silence of an aftermath, the quiet that follows a scream. Silas sat in his boat, which now drifted gently on the placid, glassy water, a lone man in a vast, silent cathedral of moonlight and stars. But the beauty of the scene was lost on him now. He was blind to it. The only thing he could see was the afterimage of the ghostly vision, burned onto the inside of his eyelids, the sorrowful face of a spectral woman and the heartbreaking, indistinct shape of a child in her arms. The apparition was gone, but the story it told remained. And that story changed everything. The vision of the ghostly mother and child had taken the familiar local legend of Mary Feltram and shattered it, rearranging the pieces into a new, far darker, and more tragic picture. The fisherman, a man who had thought he knew every story the lake had to tell, now realized he had only ever known the surface. The true, terrible secret had been hidden in the depths, waiting for a witness. The old story, the one whispered by the fire and recorded in the dusty parish books, was a simple tragedy. It was the story of Mary Feltram, the beautiful young woman who had tragically drowned while trying to elope with her forbidden love. It was a sad story, a tale of lost love and youthful misfortune. It was a story that elicited pity. But the vision he had just witnessed told a different tale. It was not a story of a single tragic death. It was the story of a double death. A mother and her child. This single, terrible new fact recontextualized the entire legend, turning it from a simple ghost story into a profound and chilling mystery. The heart of this mystery, the question that now pulsed in the silent night air, was the identity of this phantom child. Who was it? And what did its existence mean? The official story, the story of an accidental drowning, had always seemed plausible, if tragic. A young woman, alone in a boat, caught in a sudden storm, it was a believable accident. But the presence of a baby changed the entire equation. A woman would not take a small infant out onto a lake at night to elope. The risk would be too great. The logistics impossible. The presence of the child meant that the original story, the official story, had to be a lie. A deliberate fabrication designed to conceal a much more terrible truth. And this led to the inevitable, horrifying conclusion. Mary Feltram's death, and the death of her child, was no accident. It was a crime, a murder. The chilling mystery was not about a drowning. It was about a double homicide that had been successfully covered up for 20 years. The ghost of Mary Feltram was not just a sorrowful spirit, weeping for a lost love. She was the ghost of a murdered woman, a murdered mother, crying out for a justice that had been denied to her. The ghostly cry, which had been so full of a heartbreaking, generalized sorrow, was now recontextualized in Silas's mind. It was no longer just the sound of a lost soul. It was the specific, eternal, and supernatural weeping of a mother for her lost child. It was the sound of a bond so powerful that not even death could break it. She was not just mourning her own stolen life. She was mourning the life of the infant in her arms, a life that had been extinguished before it had even truly begun. The depth of the grief he had felt, the profound sadness that had infected his own soul, was the shared, amplified grief of both mother and child, an emotion so powerful it had been imprinted on the very fabric of the lake itself. And what did this mean for the story of her forbidden love? The legend had always painted her lover as a romantic, tragic figure, a man who had lost his love to a cruel fate. But now, with the revelation of a secret child, he was cast in a new, and potentially more sinister, light. Was he the father of the child? So, did he know about it? Was he on his way to meet not just his lover, but his new family? Or was he a man who had abandoned his responsibility, leaving Mary alone to face the consequences of their love? Or, a darker thought still, was he complicit in their deaths? Was the elopement a lie, a lure to get a desperate, disgraced young mother out onto the dark water where she and her inconvenient child could be disposed of without witnesses? The number of suspects in this 20-year-old crime had suddenly, terrifyingly, narrowed. The appearance of the ghostly figures now seemed to Silas to be more than just a random haunting. It felt deliberate, purposeful. It was a plea. For 20 years, Mary Feltram's spirit had been trapped here, her true story unknown, her cries dismissed as a local superstition. But tonight, for whatever reason, she had chosen to reveal the full extent of her tragedy. She had chosen him, a simple fisherman, as her witness. The ghostly vision was not just a terrifying spectacle. It was an act of testimony. The ghost of Mary Feltram was finally showing someone the evidence of the crime. She was showing him the corpus delicti body of her lost child. She was asking for help. And this raised the final and most profound question of all. The question that would haunt Silas as he finally, shakily, picked up his oars and began the long, slow row back to the shore, his eyes constantly darting back towards the now still black water. What did the spirit of Mary Feltram truly want? On one level, the answer seemed simple. She wanted peace. She wanted her tormented spirit to be able to rest. But the vision suggested something more. The raw, powerful emotions he had felt, the grief, yes, but also a cold, simmering rage that lay beneath it suggested that her spirit was not looking for peace. It was looking for justice. Was her ghostly cry a call for her story to be told? Did she want the world of the living to finally know the truth of what had happened to her and her child? Did she want the lies in the old parish records to be corrected, her death to be reclassified from a tragic accident to a brutal murder? It would be a justice of a kind, a restoration of the truth, a clearing of her name. It would mean the reputation of her cruel father, or her faithless lover, would be destroyed, even after all these years. Perhaps that was enough. But perhaps she wanted more. The vision had been so direct, so personal. It felt less like a general broadcast of sorrow and more like a specific charge, a mission being given to him, the witness. Was she seeking retribution? Did she want the guilty party, if he were still alive, to be brought to justice? It was a chilling thought. How could a simple fisherman like him, armed only with a ghost story, hope to accuse a powerful man, to unravel a 20-year-old conspiracy. To even try would be to invite ridicule, scorn, and possibly even danger. The person who had been capable of committing such a crime would surely be capable of silencing a meddling old fisherman. And this led to the most unsettling question of all, the question that truly defines this as an unsolved mystery. The ghost had revealed the murder of a mother and child. But it had not revealed the who. Was her appearance a plea for Silas to investigate, to become her champion in the world of the living, to find the evidence that would expose her killer? Or was it something else? What if her cry was not for a human justice she knew she could never receive? What if her weeping, her constant, sorrowful haunting of this place, was its own form of justice? What if her goal was to torment her killer? If the murderer was still alive, still living in the village, he would know the legend. He would hear the stories. And on a night like this, a night with a full moon, perhaps he too could hear the faint, ghostly cry on the wind. Perhaps her eternal sorrow was her eternal revenge, a constant, supernatural reminder of his crime, a ghost that would haunt his conscience for the rest of his days. Silas reached the shore, his body trembling with cold and a deep, soul-weary exhaustion. He dragged his boat onto the shingle, his movements stiff and clumsy. He did not look back at the lake. He couldn't bear to. He knew that the Black Mere would never be the same for him again. It was no longer just a place of beauty and livelihood. It was a place of deep, dark, and unsolved sorrow. It was a watery grave that held not one, but two murdered souls. And he was now the sole living keeper of their secret. The ghostly vision had answered one question, only to create a dozen more. The mystery of what happened on Snake's Island was deeper and darker than anyone had ever imagined. And the ghost of Mary Feltram, cradling her phantom child in her arms, continued her eternal vigil, her silent, weeping presence a constant, unanswered question. Is she seeking a justice that the living can provide? Or is she simply waiting, patiently, for the soul of her murderer to one day join her in the cold, dark, and haunted waters of the Black Mere? The water grows still again. The weeping fades, leaving only the cold moonlight and a stunned fisherman. He has witnessed the true, unsolved secret of Snake's Island, a ghostly vision that cries out not for peace, but for justice. What does the spirit of Mary Feltram truly want? And after all this time, is her ghost seeking justice for herself, or for the lost child in her arms? Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for braving the shadows with Gravevale Echoes. What creepy secret haunts you? Subscribe, share your fears, and return for more gothic chills from the unseen world.